Canvas components. I think the next talk will be about a little bit higher level around how to build up, how to build performant apps. But I wanted to start with Canvas just components just because they are becoming a lot more popular, and I wanted to kind of set some best practices around components. So I'll do a quick introduction to components. This is the Canvas component. So there is, there is a distinction between Canvas component and PCF, which is the Power Platform or PowerApps controls framework, which is more the pro developer option that we have. What I'm talking about here is just the, Canvas components that you build within the studio. Again, no code, no pro code is needed. So components, again, are just reusable building blocks for Canvas apps. They are very useful in making sure that you are reusing components across apps, making them consistent. Before components, we had to duplicate a lot of area or a lot of controls within the screen in order to ensure that we have things like menus across all the screens, dialog boxes. So Canvas components are a lifesaver in that sense. They have some limitation we'll talk about, but they are constantly being improved. But for the sake of this talk, we'll talk about just what features we have existing today. Again, today we have the ability to, when we create a component, to set the input and output of a component. This is really the contract or the interface that defines what the controls gets as an input and what value it produces, as an output. And in many cases, you have controls that basically display something and shows the output is just a visual artifact, I guess. So component, for me, when you are creating components, there is, there's these two guiding principles that I try to follow, and they are a little bit contradictory, or the one is, a control should allow a user or a creator of an app or a consumer of a component should be able to use a component, customizing the component without having to worry about how the component was implemented or having to edit the component in order to kind of customize and change. So the more usable a control is, the less likely a user or a creator of an app will need to kind of update or edit the component. So a component has to be customizable to as much as possible. At the same time, you want the interface of a component to remain simple and clean. So that means that if you're exposing every single property like color and border and hundreds of properties, it becomes hard to use the component. So at the same time, if you don't expose enough of those properties, you might end up with a component that's hard to change. So you have to kind of balance between these two principles, making your component as reusable, as customizable as possible by exposing the right properties that will allow you to change and make that component as flexible as possible in many scenarios and use cases. Same time, you want a clean interface, a simple interface, so that the learning curve to use that component is not hard, and it's a simple component to use. So these are the two principles usually that high-level principle. But in order to achieve some of these two ideas, you might want to use some tricks and practices that I'm going to talk about right now. So first of all, one of the strategies that I employ to kind of balance between these two principles is exposing of a property that I call style. first of all, I typically would, expose things like color, selected color. This is an example of a menu control that needs to expose the basically an items table that defines what are the tabs of a control. So this is or a menu. Maybe I have the menu is flexible to kind of render horizontally or vertically. So there is a property for that. But there is a bunch of other properties, that I might be interested in exposing, things like the width of a particular menu item, the font type of a particular item. Those are some of the properties that I might not always need. I might not need to customize every time. But in some of the scenarios, I might want to still expose and leave for the user the ability to change those things. So rather than exposing every single property as a main property of a component, I typically, I have this notion of a style table that is used to lump all of the additional style properties together that might, not be as often used, or that might not deserve that first, might not deserve to be on the first on the controls interface. So that's one idea, that allow me to keep the interface concise and still give the maximum customization possible. So this table here, tab control, it has any key value pair that I see fit for my own, needs, internal needs of the control. And then within the control, because I'm sending that table through the input, I can actually refer to those controls, to those properties and the values that come with them. The net result is a smaller, so again, it's a more concise interface. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to discuss is this styling. Again, it's related to exposing images of a component. This is an example of a numeric up and down. It could be any control. The idea here is that this control needed to kind of leave the flexibility for a user to change the images and maybe the border, all of the aspect of the control. This is actually the same control. It's just different properties, different values fit into the properties. Here I'm exposing images. The problem with components in general, or icons within PowerApps, is you don't have the ability to add additional icons here. So we have a set of icons, but you want to make sure your component gives the user the ability to change that. Here is an example of this numeric up and down. Let me go to the actual example of a numeric up and down. So here's the image. Again, I exposed the image as one of the property, the increment button icon and the decrement button icon. So those are images, which I'm here first checking if the user did supply that. Otherwise, I'm supplying an actual SVG. Again, here, the reason this is an SVG is because I wanted to embed the actual image asset as part of the component, which makes it easy. It made it easier to move between apps, so that you don't have to bring in the images that are tied to that particular component. But the takeaway here is that for a component to also be flexible and again customizable, the idea of exposing, first defining what your default icons, whether they are in SVG or a straight reference to an image, you might want to expose as well that as an actual image, which is one of the allowed properties that you have in any particular control. So here I expose these two properties. Some other need that happen is also around colors. So you might want to expose a control again. As a user for the control, I want to drop it. I might not be interested in the blue color here. I want to change the color of the background. Same thing as any other component you have in the control that comes out of the box with PowerApps. Things like the drop down or the date picker. They all have icons that are flexible in terms of changing the color. If I take the date picker, the ability to change the actual icon here, the color of the icon are all things that are exposed as part of the behavior of the date picker component or control. So similarly, a component that you build should be able to react the same way. For that, you do have the ability to expose the color that will be part of the icons that you're using as part of your control. So here in this particular example, I have a spinner control. It's an SVG that I actually included as part of my component. However, I defined a variable that I inject as part of my SVG description or markup. And then using that, I can actually expose the color that I'm interested in adding and using. Again, this is just so that if someone is using a component, they not only can change the things like font and color and size and all that stuff, but they can also change the icon colors and the icon image as well. Another important thing to do for components is this idea of responsiveness. So if you are shrinking this or changing the orientation, your component reacts properly to that behavior. So why is this important? Again, it's just so that, if you're building a component, you're giving it to your organization, everyone in the organization has the ability to kind of use it within a tablet or a phone. They can use the right styling for their app without having to go and edit the component itself. So non-visual components. So this is kind of a way, if you see, I know the platform has some work in process right now to kind of improve or give you the ability to build basically the idea of a function. For me, this is an example of the let's actually show the component. So I have this component called geofence, which is just a component that takes as an input a bunch of parameters, latitude, longitude, and radius, and then basically tells you within if you are within the radius of that particular lat and long, and the distance that you are between you and that particular point. So it's a simple component. It doesn't have any visual. The idea was to basically the idea was to hide or to kind of abstract some of the complexity. Some of the complexity that you have that you might not want to expose or have as part of your app. So the component itself will disappear. So you would drop it. You can see it here. When I go on play mode, it disappears. But the consumer of that component here was just this label that checks, that basically checks whether gets the output of the component here and here. So again, use component if you feel like, for now at least, use it as a way to also abstract complexity. So this component can be useful to many in the organization or not, but at least for you as creator of an app, you might want to simplify a bit your code within the app by pushing some of that more complex logic and calculations within a component. Makes it also easier to test. and and do validation as well. So there is a limitation today. We can't define event properties within a component. So we saw here that when we are building a component, you have the ability to expose input or output properties. There is a work on the backlog right now, and that will give you the ability to expose events as well. So things like on select on a component can be done, on click event, things like that might be useful. For now, because we don't have that pattern, we don't have that functionality, there are a bunch of components that requires a little bit extra plumbing. Things like a dialog box is an example where you might want to respond to this OK and cancel button outside the context of the component. So there is a clear pattern here that that you could use, which is again just showing using a toggle button outside within your app to respond to event like an OK button clicked or a cancel button clicked. Let me show that in action actually. So here is a dialog box. I'm going to click OK. OK. So when you click OK here, you navigate to a different screen. I guess cancel, you stay in the same screen. So if you're building a component, again, as part of making it generic, is to not hard code even the action that are within the component. So when we looked at the tab control here, this one it was an easier case here because every action here took you to a different screen. So it's always a navigate action. So in this case, we had the luxury to actually, hard code in a way the action of navigating when you click in one of those items here. So all we had to do for that tab control is to do the navigate to the current screen that is being provided as part of the items collection that defines not only the name of the label of the screen, but also where that screen is going. Or clicking on the screen. So here, if I show the items collection, which is a menu, let me see if I'm defining also where my screen is going. But the bottom line is that this menu is not as flexible as it could have been. It would have been great to create a system or a component that not only can take, this particular tab to another screen, but maybe the second tab could have been more, takes you out of the, launch you into a different browser, or at least expose for you the ability to control where those actions are, what the result of clicking on an item within your component will lead you. So in the dialog box example, the way we worked around it is by exposing properties that not only give us a hint whether the dialog is open or closed, but also gives us another output property called selected button, which tells you which button has been clicked as part of this, interacting with this dialog. So here, the way we make these dialog buttons flexible as well, even in terms of how many buttons you have, is by using a horizontal gallery control. This horizontal gallery control understands a particular schema. So the schema is really the label of the button, the colors of the button if you need to have a different style. Again, this could be a lot more sophisticated than that. But the bottom line is that we are using a gallery control to render the component, the multiple buttons that we have. When you click on a particular button, the onSelect of the button will actually set this variable to the current item. This is again, we are interested in making sure we give enough information to the outside world that the dialog is open and that that we are clicking on a particular button and we need to know what the button is. So with this, it becomes pretty easy pattern for now. Again, this dialog event handler will soon disappear once we have the functionality to expose event handlers. But for now, these dialog event handlers, as you can see here, simply react to the OK and cancel button depending on what the button that was selected or not. The dialog, this toggle button default is again linked to that variable is open that gives us a hint whether we opened or closed the dialog. So this is typically a pattern you could use anytime you are building a component that requires you to not have any understanding of what the actions are within buttons in that component, which is another, so the behavior that you have internally in the component should also like not hard code actions again. So again, going back to the best practices, when looking at some of those principles here plus this, the whole idea is to kind of not make a component as flexible from a style and look and feel perspective, but also from a behavior perspective. And sometimes, sometimes you have to live with it. Like in the case of the menu component, 99% or 90% of the times you do need a menu component that still is used purely to go between apps, between screens within your app. So it's okay to not go the extra length of making it super generic in that case. Yeah. So that's kind of where I am here. So there is, so recently I have blogged about business process flow component. As part of that exercise, I wanted to make sure I built a very flexible component that can be used in many situations. So let me go as well to that blog post. So here's an example. Again, for those who we mentioned it yesterday, is that business process flow technology we have as part of Power Automate now allow you to create business process flow. This blog post is about how to build a reusable components that can consume any business process flow and render the right UI for it. All of the fields, the timeline. Here is an example of the component loading a very unique entity, a specific entity for that particular BPF, called employee onboarding entity. The component understands how to kind of render itself depending on the schema of the component. So that's the same component here. You can see it in a different look and feel. Nothing changed from an implementation perspective. I didn't have to edit the component in order to kind of give it a completely different style. So here is a kind of example of some of the stuff I exposed in order to customize the component. But you can notice here that there is a timeline that I wasn't first sure that the default look of it is nice enough. Also, I wanted to make sure that if a user is going to create component BPF within Canvas, that they can really build any timeline they want, and there's a lot of example of what that timeline looks like. Let me go back here. So in order to kind of make sure we don't lock the component into a layout and a look and feel that might not be appropriate, one idea that's always useful is to expose all of the available useful properties. Here, I exposed active stages or all of the stages that we see here. the actual active stage where someone is currently working on, or actively, and the active stage of a BPF, and then finally a selected stage, because you could, could be going back within this timeline to see to select a stage and see information that might have that was in a previous stage. So by exposing these 3 parameters and also the ability to hide and show the timeline, I basically gave a lot more flexibility to my component, because now someone can hide aspects of the component, or even hide the entire component and use just kind of the output properties that might be useful in their own visuals that they might want to implement. Here again, I did hide all of the the timeline here. I made sure that the rest of the UI is automatically adjusted to the top of the screen, and then I let the user go and customize the timeline by using the so here is the actual component. So this is, again, I have this ability to change wrap count here so that I have different layouts exposed. Those are a few things you do just so to give some flexibility. Again, it's not always possible to do everything imaginable, but the more you do, the less likely someone has to worry about editing a component. The timeline that I'm discussing right now is outside the component. So someone here just basically just hit the actual timeline, the default timeline of the component. Let me go back to the component. So you can see the timeline is set to false, so I don't show the actual timeline of the component. I'm only using a gallery control to take the output of the component and show the active stages. These allow me to render all of the stages. And then the other information, such as things like active selected, or maybe I'll go to the fill color of the actual button here. You can see here that I'm getting that from the active stage, which is another output of the component. Unfortunately, there is a limitation, so I couldn't change the name of the variable here. But again, the fact that I'm having active stage is already a good thing to kind of allow me to tell from outside the component where we are. But this is kind of the easiest way to ensure that your component is response to teaming that you see here. So you want your component to understand what that, understand that, and I reflect it in that within the components, within the controls within the component. So the easy way to do it is by keeping a default style button, a hidden button that never changes, that hasn't been, you don't touch the fill or any of the properties of this control. You just drop it and make it, put it somewhere on the screen in an invisible fashion. I usually don't like having additional controls, but this one was the only, one of the easiest way to kind of ensure that someone, your own controls within the screen reflects the teaming, the current teaming. So the reason this works is because this default style button will inherit any changes to the teaming that's applied to your app. However, your components or controls that you dropped into your screen, you might want to be interested in not only, applying the current theme if that's what the user wants, or you might want to expose colors that are going to be the main way for a user to change the color for a component. You need to do that anyway, like the main fill, background, the fill, the color, the border. Those are all properties that you should expose so that the component is customizable. However, as soon as you expose that and you tie it to the fill of your own button, you will lose the teaming ability. So in order to avoid that, you keep kind of a track or record kind of the current style by having a button here, and then you refer to it in this manner. So if the user exposed the color or sorry, supply the color for the input here through the input color of the component. That's great. You use it. Otherwise, you go and make sure you use the default style, the default color that's currently represents the applied theme. So this is actually the last thing I was gonna talk about, which is really the ability to create components that even are schema agnostic. But this is kind of an example of where my component did not really need to worry even about what are the properties that are on, and this is maybe the most you could do currently is just like, and it's pretty painful to do, I have to say. It's an advanced scenario, but the idea with this component is not only the style, the colors are as customizable as possible, but also the type of data that you that you input to it matters as well. Sorry, the type of data that you input has to kind of stay agnostic to the component, so that you don't have to kind of go and hard code the schema within your component. I guess I'm going to go back to just to kind of explain it a little bit more. I'll go back to this example that I skipped. All right, so the scenario I had here is that this is a conference app. I had a feed scenario, so where people that are going through the conference can upload images and comment on them, and basically it's a social component to the app, so that there's a bit more viral aspect to it. So I was interested in making sure this component here is a component that I can also use as part of my comment of my session comment. So this conference has sessions. Every session, I wanted to enable users to give comments on the session. So I wanted to make sure that this component worked with any various schemas. It could be the feed entity, or it could be the comment entity. And I wanted to make sure I don't have to reduplicate the component just so that I stick in a different entity schema. So in order to kind of unify or kind of make sure that the component is as generic as possible, anyway, so the feed property here has an items a property named items, which is of type table. So the idea is to pick the most generic names for things like the title of the card, I guess, or the item, the photo of the person who created the entry, the text or the content that goes with it. So those are all names that the component would understand. So the component itself only understands this generic table that has property names like image, display name, user title, user photo, and feed text. And the more generic those names are, the better it is, so that the component can be used for many scenarios. Again, here for this particular app, I wanted to use it within comments or within the activity feed of the conference. So it's an activity or a feed collection. And the idea is that before you supply the controls with the actual data, you take that initial input that comes, that initial table that you might have, and then you basically patch it in such a way that you add columns that are going to normalize, or that's going to be basically having the right name, column name, by duplicating again the images or the actual property that you need inside those column names. So here, for example, my feed property, my feed entity, which I'm patching here, had an object, a lookup to a created by, which had a full name. Of course, the component doesn't understand that. So in order to mitigate that, I just add a column and normalize if you want that, so that I can extract the name from created by lookup and put it in the display name. So again, if we look at the component had a table. It had very specific expectations in terms of the schema. So it was really up to the user of the component to understand what that schema looks like. And that's easy when you drop the component, you understand what that schema is. And then it's up to that consumer to make sure that when they get to the page or when they get to render this or create that feed, they are actually going and making sure that they are creating the right format for your particular. So here I'm going through and making sure that my collection has the actual transformation from my feed collection into the right schema. Sorry, so this is all to say that you can make your component generic in this fashion by making sure you by making sure your input property is generic enough, and understanding that the user of the component can adapt their entities so that it actually matches the proper schema expected by the component. So component libraries are, again, very advisable, something that you might want to use. It's a new feature, again, for those who haven't played with it. Again, it's a way to package your components within components library, making it a lot more easy to move and distribute across your organization. The components, again, are going to be super useful for you to kind of making sure you have a story when it comes to sharing your components across organizations. So it's very strongly advisable to use it. So another best practice. It makes the whole distribution, importing, updating of apps that have dependency on components just seamless. So you can imagine in an organization, again, default components that are used across all of the apps of an organization. You could imagine some members of your team or members of that are, okay, we could call it a shared component team, maybe dedicated to creating those components and distributing them across organization. It is like up until now, it wasn't really a seamless story because you could be building components and it still was hard to go back and update the apps that might have dependencies on this component. Even understanding what apps have dependencies on which component was a challenge. When a component gets updated, the apps that were referencing this component gets a notification, and you can choose to update or even make a local copy of that component if that's something if you want to fork out of the official components that might have been distributed to you. So again, very useful stuff to have. The other component, kind of the other thing that I alluded to yesterday in the context of HR apps, is this idea of using components as a mean to do distribution or collaborative development. And the idea here is that if you break down an app with its main components, the one that are common to all apps can be coming from a shared library, a shared component library, with dedicated people working on that. An app could have specific custom components that are only useful maybe in the context of that app, but that's still useful to build as a component because you are making it a lot more modular in that fashion. You can easily describe what are input and output of all of those components, and then have a consistent way of testing whether those components are doing the job. You can also ensure that the consistency in how visual on the visuals and the look and feel. So again, here was just an example of a conference app that basically used the same idea of component and made sure that actually it was built in such a way that specific users or creators were able to kind of focus on specific components. Here you have the search component, the day filter component. Those have specific outputs as this app was being organized or being planned, it was clear that the input for the gallery control that you see here was going to be driven by the output of the search text and selected day. The output of this gallery itself, along with a navigation action, allow you to kind of go and do the interaction for this page and go to the next page. Again, this is again the same concept we alluded yesterday, the idea of creating a generic component and being able to go and update this component independently of the main app, and that's allowing you to kind of create this idea of distributed collaborative development within PowerApps, which is something that customers always ask for, and it's not always there's not really a straight answer. The platform does not allow you to edit an app, have multiple people editing the same app. So this is a pretty good argument, for those who need that, feature. The fact that you're using component will give you a lot more benefit in reusability and testability and all that stuff.